I'm Lee Moore,
I'm Rob Moore.
and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, today, thank you for joining me. You're in Paris?
I'm not well. I'm in France, but as of course you and I and everyone know, all of France is actually in Paris.
That's right.
You can see the Eiffel Tower from anywhere you are. Everyone wears a beret and rides a bicycle with a baguette in the front basket. There's accordion music currently playing outside my window. People are discussing philosophy very angrily in the town square and playing pétanque. It's pretty much what you expect, really.
That sounds fabulous. I bring that up partially to hear what's going on, Rob, and the philosophy discussions sound interesting, but also just to note we're trying a new format because Rob, you recently moved to France.
Moved to France, or of
Yeah.
course Paris, which is basically the same thing, as of
Same
course we
thing.
all
Yeah,
know.
exactly. But hopefully sound quality is going to be okay.
Yep,
Rob, it
we're
sounds good to
using.
you, right?
It sounds good so far. I mean, it's hard to tell. Looking at our recording things, it looks like our peaks and valleys are a little different on the recording line here. But hopefully, that's not gonna impair us too much. I mean, we are still brilliant, so that'll still come across.
You are still brilliant. I am just a humble person who lacks, as Ouyang Xiu would say, who lacks ability to judge the
Well,
calligrapher's
the
skill.
only thing you lack, Lee, you're about to have. Once you get that PhD finished, you're officially brilliant. It's not really a matter of ability; it's more just credentials. If you can put the PhD on your CV,
Said like
that's
a true Frenchman.
that's it. That's it. All you need is the qualification from the government, my friend.
So I bring that up. Just listeners, let us know if you're having trouble hearing this.
Especially if you're having trouble hearing me, that's really the more important consideration.
Um, but on that note, I think we should turn to the finale. Is this
Yes,
the finale? Is this the last one we're going to do on the Song
it
Dynasty?
it is, unless we find something else that interests us and we want to include something else in our accidental series on the song.
We should do another accidental ending.
Yeah, we should. We should just see how long we can keep this running. Just do the entire song in like a year, and people will go, "How did we get here?"
I honestly think we could do the song for a whole year. It's
Oh,
just that
absolutely.
interesting.
Yeah, it's a
I,
fascinating period.
the Song Dynasty is a period that I had very little understanding of the literature. Everybody reads about the Tang. The
Yes.
Tang is the big thing, Rob, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That's and in fact, if you're going to teach Chinese literature to people who've never read it, you almost always go with Du Fu and Li Bai. I mean, those are the canonical examples. But I have to say, if I was given the chance to just do, let's say, 10 weeks, a good 10-week term just on Chinese poetry, I'd do a lot of song poetry.
I've been kind of stunned at how good song poetry is and how little uh, press it gets. I don't know
Oh,
if
yeah.
that's the right word because I don't know how much press Chinese poetry gets. I guess we are the Chinese
We're
poetry
it. We're
press.
it's given how much we've talked about the song, I think you can say it doesn't get a lot of press. But as you say, this is probably the finale, and we end with a good one. Ouyang Xiu. Now, this is one of the rare examples. I want to point this out right off the top here of a Chinese name where the two syllable name is the first part and the one syllable is the second. His family name is Ouyang, and his given name is Xiu. That's very rare.
Yeah, I think there's only really Sima, as in Sima
Sima
Qian and
Qian.
Ouyang, and those are the main ones. There are a couple of others, but
Right.
yeah.
So Ouyang Xiu is 1007 AD to 1072. So
And he's one of the sort of founders of Song Dynasty. I was going to say poetry, but he really did so much. He was a
yeah,
calligrapher. He was a politician, like all of the others
yes,
poets that we've read so far. They're all politicians and poets. And he was and I'm going to struggle with this word. He did epigraphy. He was an epigrapher.
yes. He was we I guess we would use the word in I'll use a good French phrase since I'm in French, belles lettres, like the not just poetry,
Yes.
but essays and like you say calligraphy. He was sort of an all-around jack of all trades in the arts.
And and there really wasn't that much separation between these different genres in the song. I mean, in earlier Chinese dynasties, you did definitely have a separation, but everybody, if you were going to be a politician, you were expected to be a good poet.
Yes. You had to. I mean, you either had to be an accomplished poet or you had to at least be able to say intelligent things about poetry. Because in ancient China, a lot of times the latter is as highly praised as the former, being able to have novel and original things to say about poetry.
The way you did political networking was through poetry. So if you wrote a really good poem and it got shared through the social networks of the time, that is, literature, and literature poems are just kind of being passed around in the Song and in earlier dynasties too. It's not unique to the Song, but what is unique to the Song is that poetry becomes kind of the way you make your name. You have to do this exam that becomes big in the Song. The exam had existed in the Tang, but it became huge in the Song. And the exam was kind of a test of different forms of literary knowledge. And then once you became an official, or even if you weren't an official, even if you were outside of officialdom, you still wrote poems, because people who wrote poems actually got invited to lecture, and so they could actually make money at these academies that are popping up all over Song China that become spaces for training people to take that exam. So we talked about the importance of the exam before, and I think in our our first Ouyang Xiu podcast, right, Rob?
Yeah, yeah. Because Wang Ansher was one of the ones who wanted to completely overhaul how it was done. And one of the things he wanted to do was make poetry not the center of the exam, because his argument was, look, uh, I want people who can actually run the kingdom here, and I don't care where they come from. I don't care if they're from a farm. So we have to make it such that if you have something of value to say about how to run the country from wherever you're from, that's the person we want, as opposed to just someone who's had the money and the access to power long enough to know all the right poems.
So
Um,
again, we get kind of into that LBJ
yeah,
versus
yeah,
Ronald Reagan dichotomy. I don't think it maps on quite at what you're saying, but there is a kind of, you can see some leftish positions from the American political scene versus some rightish positions from the American political scene.
yeah, agreed. Now, the passage that we're talking about here from Ouyang Xiu is a really neat example of his jack of all trade ness. We're getting it from, again, the Stephen Owen translation. It's just called Seal Script in Stone, written in 1045. And it was written shortly after he was made governor of a prefecture near Longya Mountain. He calls it Longya Mountain. Now he's sent out to look for examples of seal script, SEAL script. Uh, can you tell anyone what we're talking about when we're talking about seal script?
So it's an old style of Chinese writing. It was used in making seals. That's where the name comes from, and it's particularly prized in calligraphy. Ouyang Xiu here, in searching for seal script, is actually doing something that's really interesting. This particular piece is kind of represents a pivot point in Chinese civilization, in Chinese history. Uh, Previously, during the Tang, there were poets, particularly Rob. I think we talked about this on our podcast on Dufu, but Dufu was very much the historian poet, right? He was the shishi, the poet who looked at history. But there tended in the Tang to be less of a backwards look at history in general than in the Song. The
True.
Song is very much about kind of collecting all of this old stuff. So the word that I struggle with, epigraphy, that is something that really takes off with Ouyang Xiu and the Song, and it's about kind of, if you've been to China, you've probably seen where you'll have these giant steles and you'll have stone rubbings of those steles, and that will be a way to distribute what was said on them. Those
Hmm.
become very big as a kind of collector's item with Ouyang Xiu. Ouyang Xiu is, I don't know, is it right to call him like a museum guy? He kind of sort of starts something that would be sort of like museum collecting. It's not a real museum, but he starts this tradition in China which extends to today, where you have collections of old Chinese things, particularly stone rubbings, all kinds of calligraphy.
He's an archivist, I suppose we could call him. Uh,
What's the right word? There's a word for this. Antiquarian. That's what it is. He's an
that's what he
antiquarian,
is.
right?
Yeah, Yeah.
And that antiquarian tradition, which you see emerging in places like Britain in maybe the 18th century, starts way earlier in China.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
starting with Ouyang Xiu.
But now what's fascinating, let's get to the piece here. So he has a long prose lead in. The idea is he finds an example of a very rare seal script by the calligrapher and poet Li Yangbing, which is on a rock that he finds kind of randomly. He's led to it by a monk. And right next to the rock is a completely different poem that either no one's ever read or no one knows about. And he's just utterly floored by it, by just the beauty of the imagery and everything else. And he doesn't know what to do about it. It's just so overwhelming. He decides I have to try to respond to this in poetry because he's a song dude, right? That's what you do if you're a song dude. You respond in poetry. But he does the great humble Chinese poet thing, and he goes, you know what though, I knew whatever I wrote was going to be garbage, so I said, you know what, I'm just going to have to send it to two poets I admire above all others, and just ask for their mercy and grace on my poor verse, you know.
He literally says that in one line in the poem. He's like, "Poor me who lacks ability to judge the calligrapher's skill," and that's what I was alluding to earlier. So he is doing this kind of humble praise thing, right?
Right, right. But what's particularly interesting, and for my money, the poets he's writing to and their responses are not all that interesting. And you can make the case he didn't really care that much in the first place. He just has to frame it in a certain way. Um, but the way he presents the poems is really interesting. And maybe we can talk a little bit about how it relates to his antiquarianism. Owen's translation is a teeny bit long to read the whole thing, but I would like to read one passage that I think is super interesting, and that is he writes a little bit about how he sees it, how he comes across it. The guy who wrote it is dead. The monk led him to it, and then he says, "It seemed to me these characters were made by no stroke of the brush. It seemed, in fact, things not to be done by human powers at all. When first the earth and heavens in embryo split apart, the primal force congealed to this high and looming thing. In those days, birds of the wilderness stepped on the mountain stone. They left their tracks forever here, upon these slate gray slopes."
It's almost like it's a work of nature. That the poem that he's reading is not something that's human made. It's actually made either by the 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 just an act of nature, or the gods themselves at a certain time. I mean, if we keep reading, it talks about the god of the mountain did not want men to see it often. So it does seem like this divine thing. Rob, can I ask you, we are when this Song Dynasty series ends, we're starting Journey to the West, I think, that
Yes,
series,
we are.
right?
That's the schedule. Yep.
And we don't we don't know if this is the last one or not, but this this passage, these stanzas that you read, really reminded me of the creation of Monkey. Do you remember
Yes.
that passage at the beginning of
Yes.
Shioji, the Journey to the West, where it's, this rock that kind of is divine, and it's kind of in between heaven and earth, and an embryo splits apart, and this primal force kind of becoming congealed into Monkey.
Yes.
That's so. I almost wonder, historically, the novel Journey to the West has been assigned to the author Wu Cheng'en, but we don't really know how much of a role he played in it. But I kind of wonder if whoever wrote that first passage, that first chapter of Journey to the West, was actually drawing off of this poem. I have no evidence for that, but it's so similar in terms of how the poem itself is conceived, and how Monkey is conceived of in Shioji.
The difference is that in this case, when he talks about birds walking on the mountain rocks, Owen points it out, but not to toot my own horn, I kind of figured that out before I read Owen's notes, so that makes me super smart. Um, that the mythical origin of Chinese characters is bird tracks. That Tang Jie, who was supposedly the one who came up with Chinese characters, was inspired by the tracks of birds on rocks and put those down. In any case, however you read it, the idea is that the Chinese character just arose, just sort of almost sprang directly from nature. That there's just really one step between actual bird tracks and writing.
And that comes from this idea. So not only with Cangjie that writing emerges. He gets the idea for writing from bird tracks, which it almost seems like it's evolving out of nature. But this idea that Chinese writing itself, that is Wen, is part of this primordial force that somehow embodies and encompasses the truth of the universe, which is one of the reasons why during the late Song and during the late Qing, when you have these barbarians at the gate, the obviously in the Song that was the Mongols and some of the proto-Mongol dynasties, and during the late Qing that was the British, the French, those imperialists. The Chinese just kind of go, wait a second, how can you even be fully human if you don't understand Chinese characters? There's something of that going on here in this Ouyang Xiu poem, that he's suggesting that there is some primordial truth in the written characters of the poem that he's reading on this rock. It's not something that's been carved into this rock by just a person, an individual who has a history that we can trace. It's actually like emerging from the earth itself.
Well, and there's a strong school of aesthetic thought in Chinese history that's like that. That artistic perfection is such that I remember reading, I forget the artist's name now, I'd have to go back and refer to it, but an artist of the so called Mountains and Waters school, that he painted stunningly beautiful pictures with no brush. The idea being that what you're looking at is exactly the thing itself. They
It's
just wish
almost
somehow to
Taoist.
yeah, it's almost, well, it's very Confucian, right? That classic Confucian. I'm not going to attempt to quote it direct, where he says, "I do not create, I transmit." The idea that the ideal is not I do something that's never been done and which
But you actually
transcends
become a
anything.
vessel
Yeah,
for the truth, the truth of reality, to kind of enter from the universe, go through your body, go out your hand, and come out of your brush.
right. And it's interesting from Ouyang Xiu, this reflection, because when you read this poem, you wonder to yourself, because like you say, Ouyang Xiu was a great politician as well, and so were Wang Anshi and Su Dongpo,
I don't know if Wang Anshi was a great politician.
and of course Li Jingzhao, who wasn't herself a politician, was married to and then closely involved with a husband who was a politician, which is in ancient China was very, very
It's
similar,
about as
right?
close as you can get as a woman to being a
Yes.
politician in
So
pre-modern
they were
China.
all there. They were all in this world. Anyway, it's hard to think of something more manufactured and synthetic than politics, right? Because it can't possibly be springing fully formed from nature because it deals entirely with human behavior, right? And
It was Aristotle who said man is a political animal. That is, I mean, one way to interpret that is man, the only thing that separates them and makes them not animals is politics, right?
right, and you know, and Rousseau comes to this is in a couple of centuries later, where look, the whole point is that we're not from nature, right? That's it. You know, if we're all going to be completely, totally free like the animals, well, then we should start killing each other and eating each other. That's the way that works. But the point is, we're not that. Well, I wonder if there's a strain of this in Ouyang Xiu's poem where he is involved in something that's very unnatural, and yet he's looking at this thing and going, yet what I'm looking at is so much more beautiful than any of the stuff I'm involved with. What am I involved with? I mean, do you see any sort of maybe latent regret or melancholy possibly about his political activities?
I don't. I think that there's no regret here in his political activities as far as I can see. Sorry,
Yeah.
Rob.
Well, it's just pure conjecture. Like you're with your Journey to the West thing, you have no evidence to back it up because we're good
Yeah.
literary scholars for that. Pure
We don't have to
conjecture.
have evidence.
We don't have to have evidence. Who needs evidence? We don't have like a lab or anything. We're not going to
I want to
titrate this into solution.
I want to just point something out. So I'll read a stanza, another stanza. The man who wrote it now is dead. His bones have rotted away, but these his words do not perish. In the mountain folds they stay. So with that stanza, I think it's fascinating because we've been talking about Chinese characters and Chinese writing being imagined to emerge from nature. But here we actually have this kind of overcoming of nature. That is the ultimate act of nature is death and regeneration. But there is this kind of unnatural permanence to this poem because it's inscribed on the rock. by this human kind of lives on. And whereas all the rest of nature kind of gets consumed in this cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, this poem is it has a kind of continuity that nature doesn't provide. So there is a lot about nature in this poem, but there's also this kind of adoration, I guess is the right
Mm,
word, of the sort of human ability to preserve things from death, and even though the body itself dies, the poem lives on.
yeah, and there's something. One of the other things that strikes me here, it's another literary reference, and it'll be on a podcast that we post later in the year. Is Lu Xun, the great Lu Xun, who's sitting in the courtyard of a friend's house in one of his washed up years, when he's basically forsaken all writing and everything's pointless and he's just sitting and brooding. And what he's doing is trying to decipher seal script on a stone, much like Ouyang Xiu is doing. Only in this case, it has been largely eroded. He's trying to piece together what it might say. And what's interesting, of course, in this case, is his friend comes in and says, "Hey, what are you doing?" Lucian goes trying to read this Steely script, and his host is like, "Why?" And he's like, "I don't know." It becomes a point of reference for just how pointless his life has become. That he's trying to figure this thing out. That time itself has decided, yeah, let's maybe just get rid of this, right? Like, let's go ahead and erode it after all. Um, so it's interesting that in both cases, though in a slightly different direction, there's a lot of melancholy over what they're looking at. Ouyang Xiu is deeply appreciative of it. He's almost worshipful of it, right? But as you say, there's something almost unnatural about its longevity. Something that is remarkable and that Ouyang Xiu is not sure what to do with, and frankly, neither does Lu Xun.
Well, I think, Rob, that's a pretty good place to hang our hats. I mean, this has been actually pretty decent chatting with you over internet. Has it been okay for you?
It's been fine for me. We'll let the listener decide if the sound quality just goes right down the drain. Then we'll know we have some work to do. But
Yeah, listeners, please send us an email, Chinese Literature Podcast at gmail.com. Let us know what you think.
send us a tweet too if you're on Twitter and you actually follow us on Twitter. We don't do a whole lot on Twitter, but we do pay attention to it occasionally.
It's a very un-Chinese literary kind of medium, right? Like it's
Yes,
all about instantaneity, instant
Inst- instantaneity, I guess.
instantaneity, maybe, yeah. And it's very much the opposite of much of what Chinese literature is about. This Ouyang Xiu poem, I think, is pretty much the opposite of a tweet, right? Like he's talking about the permanence of this writing, and a tweet is supposed to, just disappear, at least until you have, a hearing where you're being judged whether or not you can become an official or a CEO, in which
Right,
its lack of permanence becomes
very
very
permanent.
clear very quickly.
Yes, indeed.
All right. Well, I'm Lee Moore,
I'm Rob Moore.
and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.